I applaud all of you for inviting me to come and talk to you. I welcome any questions afterwards, or if it's really important during, because I think that the only foolish question is the one that you don't ask. So feel free to ask me. This is part of my family story, and it's a part that has kind of exploded a few years ago, unbelievably, and it's a very important part of my family because my parents were survivors. I never had grandparents, aunts or uncles, or cousins, and the people that my parents met along the way, they were my extended family. So I'm going to try and give you a little bit of a preface because otherwise we'll be here at least till Friday, which you may not mind, but the teachers may. And because there's so much. There is just so much. So again, quick overview. My mother, who is deceased, came from Lithuania, which is one of the Baltic countries. It's Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, next to the Baltic Sea. And my father came from, you would call it the Ukraine. Is that, it's kind of hard to define on what day and where, who it belongs to. But, so, my mother happened to escape because if you look at Hoover Road and you look at the house across the street, it was literally the people on one side of the street were all captured. And my mother happened to have been visiting her sister, and she was on this side of the street. And she was able to escape. But there was never a day that went by that she didn't have survivor guilt. She always felt that she should have gone to be with her parents. Thank you. So, again, a very, very brief synopsis. My parents met in Uzbekistan. Anyone know where that is? Okay. You can, where is it?
It's like in the middle of Asia, upper middle, like under Russia a little bit.
Good, good. We're getting the map together here.
It's like under Kazakhstan.
South of us.
Well, Kazakhstan is a city, but or the state. Yeah. Now that's sorry. I'm sorry. You're right. But it was basically where my parents ended up, and it was on the border with Afghanistan. And Uzbekistan only got notoriety when the war broke out with Afghanistan and with Iraq and all that, because they used their airplanes would be refueled, etc. over there. So I'd heard about it my whole life, and suddenly people knew what I was talking about, because otherwise, you know, it's not a very well-known area of the world. It's Muslim, and their observances are very different, and your teacher can explain, or Mrs. Gettinger, it's home for the Bukhara Jews, who have a whole segment of observances that are different than the others. So, okay, so, again, my mother was in Uzbekistan. My father was drafted. The only reason he survived was because he was in part of Poland that September 1st, 1939, when Germany occupied Poland, the Russians had agreed to move their line into an occupied part of Poland. When the Russians occupied that part of Poland, my father lived there, nice yeshiva boy, and he was immediately drafted into the Russian army. Little did he know, or anyone know, that that's the only reason he survived. The rest of his family was killed, but he became an officer in the Soviet army. And you're not going to have to remember all these things because I'm really going to tie them together, I promise. After the war, when they were in this very southern part of Russia, they really didn't have thorough knowledge of what had happened during the war. And they headed toward the Baltic because that was where my mother was from. And they traveled all through Russia. So this was it was a big distance. They traveled all through Russia and ended up in, it's called Vilnius. Vilna, or Vilnius is the Baltic, the Baltic, yeah. That's what they consider their language. Excuse me. And they ended up in Vilnius. Simchas Torah was a very interesting time in my particular, I didn't do it, in our lives, meaning my family, because every Simchas Torah, our parents would tell us the story of going to the Vilna shul that had been an unbelievably beautiful, big milestone. You know, it was known forever, and it was totally desecrated in 1945. But they still went there to celebrate. So, of course, not having any Sifrei Torah, because you know that the Germans thought they made very nice lampshades, among other things. The people that came there decided to carry the children, because that would substitute for the Sifrei Torah that you would be carrying on Simchas Torah. So now, if you can keep all those things together, I'm going to read you something and kind of explain why I'm here. The title of this is Simchat Torah from Vilnius to Detroit. I, not me, was born in Baranovich, Poland in 1940. When I was just a year old, my parents, fearful of the Nazis' relentless march across Europe and what it might portend for Jews, entrusted my life into the hands of my Polish Catholic nursemaid. Under her protection, I was baptized and hidden as a Catholic boy for 4 years. As a child so young, it was more than an assumed identity. Rather, it was an identity I took on without question. I went to church every Sunday. I was taught to cross myself every time I passed a church. When I met a priest, I kissed his hand. When we saw a Jew, I had been taught to spit on the ground. I will never forget the first time my father, Joseph Foxman, of blessed memory, took me to shul. It was on Simchas Torah in Vilnius, Lithuania, in the fall of 1945. So my parents are there, and this gentleman is there. After I reunited with my parents at the end of the war, my father slowly introduced me to the practices and traditions of the Jewish faith. But he waited 4 months before taking me to the synagogue on Simchas Torah. I'm sure he knew that to a 5-year-old child living in Vilna after the liberation, this Jewish festival full of singing and dancing would make quite an impression. And my father figured rightly so. So I would be swept up into this celebration. During the service, a Soviet officer in uniform who was Jewish, and this is my father, came up to my father and asked if he could include me in the dancing. My father agreed. "Are you Jewish?" the stranger asked. When I nodded yes, the officer remarked, "I have traveled thousands of miles without seeing a single Jewish child. 1.5 million Jewish children alone were killed in the Holocaust." So when my father said he traveled thousands of miles and didn't see a Jewish child, he really didn't. These particular children that were there were what was referred to as the hidden children, which I'll be happy to talk to you about later if you're interested. The officer hoisted me on his shoulders and began to dance, saying joyfully, "This is the Jewish flag." The older children picked me up and danced with me, and it was great. I came home and told my nanny, "Hey, I like the Jewish church." 65 years later, I would meet that Soviet officer again, in a different life, different world, and learn his name for the very first time. In speaking to audiences around the world, I frequently recall my childhood experiences during the Holocaust and the memory of my first visit to a synagogue. 4 years ago, I told the story at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, and a staff researcher taken with the story told me she would try and track down the Soviet officer in uniform I had encountered in Vilna those many years before. To my great surprise, she contacted me shortly thereafter. She had found a song by a Toronto Jewish songwriter called "The Man from Vilna" that told the exact same story. And the credits for the story she discovered the name of the man who had inspired it. The former soldier now, Rabbi Leo Goldman of Oak Park, Michigan, a suburb of Detroit. That's my father. In April 2010, during a business trip, I had the honor of finally being reunited with Rabbi Goldman, now too old to carry me on his shoulders. The former Soviet officer opted instead to shake my hand and share a hug. And he said, "It's a privilege to have lived long enough to have this moment," as we embraced in his living room. My sister, who was there, said, "Well, I thought that story was kind of legend. I always believed in my heart, but on another level I wondered, did it really happen?" My father had been wounded twice while fighting for in the Soviet Army, lost his parents and his brother. And when he returned to the synagogue in Vilna that very day, it was shortly after the concentration camps had been liberated. Vilna had a Jewish population before the war of 100,000 Jews. After the war, there were 3,000. Rabbi Goldman was ordained as an Orthodox rabbi, and he raised a family, worked as an educator and hospital chaplain. At our reunion, Rabbi Goldman and I said HHAI and then talked about our memories of Europe after the Shoah, of family members lost and long forgotten, and of our incredible good fortune of having been lucky enough to survive the war and the Holocaust, to see our children and grandchildren raised as free and proud Jews. I also had an opportunity to thank him for a wonderful Simchat Torah memory that has lasted a lifetime. The person who wrote this, and the little boy that my father carried on his shoulders, is Abraham Foxman. Abraham Foxman is the head of the ADL, Anti-Defamation League, nationally. He is an extremely prestigious man. He has done remarkable things. And if you go back and start looking at his books and everything, you will see he always brings up the story of the Jewish Soviet officer. And now we suddenly find that we know who this is. When I said, what did I do with my cough? Oh, okay, I'm sorry. I get dry when I'm nervous. So, you know, there was not a simplest Torah that my family did not hear the story again. And I still remember when I would ask my father, I would whisper it, and I don't even know why, but I would ask him who are these children? And he would whisper back, the hidden children. He told me about 2 of the children that were there. They had been kept in an attic and became mute because they were not allowed to talk for 4 years, and they became mute and couldn't talk. But they were part of the children that were carried and taken around. And like I said, if you go online, look for Abraham Foxman, Abe Foxman. He's written countless books. He's very active, and he always will talk about the turning point in his life that he always thought he would become a priest. And after this simplest Torah, he decided he liked the Jewish church and has been very proud and upfront about his background and the fact that he is Jew. So, why am I here? Anyone have any ideas? Okay.
To share information of your family's history.
Good. Any other ideas? I had nothing else to do. There's a possibility. No? Go ahead.
To tell us the story so that we can carry it on to tell future generations.
Very good. What's your name?
Aaron.
Aaron. Bingo. Good job. I speak all over the city around the time of Yom HaShoah because as hard as it is for me, and you can see that it's very emotional for me, I feel very strongly that it is an obligation that we have to talk about, Jewish and non-Jewish, because one of the most important things all of you have to know is that anybody who survived the Second World War only did that with the help of a Kadosh Baruch Hu. There are no other credits. I could tell you 10 stories right now of things that were not supposed to happen, but they did happen, and they only happened because of divine intervention. And that is something that I want to stress to all of you, that there are people that said, well, God forsake us. How could he allow this? I don't have an answer to that. But I do have an answer to why my parents, an answer that I can live with about my parents. And my parents kept the story alive. Like I said, my life was very different. No relatives, no grandparents, and it has a lot to do with who I am right now standing in front of you. Because I carry that. It's my baggage, so to speak. And I'm committed to talking about it and teaching it. Because if you leave today with nothing else, I want you to remember 2 things. One, anybody that survived, as I said, only survived because of a miracle. And like I said, you want miracles and you have time, I could just list them right off. And the other reason I'm here is I have to teach everybody, every child, and everybody now that it is their obligation to go out and share what I've shared with you. Because the survivors are passing away. And unless we know these stories, carry these stories, tell these stories, unless we go out there, it's much easier to forget bad things than good things. And the HHAI is not a particularly happy subject. No one really, I remember somebody had seen a movie on the Holocaust when I was working, and this girl comes up to me and she goes, I saw that, it was such a good movie. But that didn't really happen, did it? People don't want to believe that it happened. You can't. Your body fights it. How could something so horrendous that killed 6 million people 10 million total, have happened? And where was the world? I don't have the answer to those questions, but I do have the memories and the impressions that my parents left me with, and the strong feeling that I have to carry the baton. In November, my husband and I were lucky enough to celebrate the bar mitzvah of our first grandchild. And my father, who's in his 90s, couldn't come, but when I spoke there, see, just give me a chance, I'll speak anywhere, you know. I said to Dove, our grandson, I said, if Zadie were here, he would say, actually, he's Rabbi Zadie. We had a dilemma. We created a new name. My father's Rabbi Zadie, and that's Zadie. But I knew exactly what my father would say. He would say, this is not just one boy. This is the 300 boys from my city that were killed. It's the 300 boys from your grandmother's city that were killed. This is not one person standing in front of you. This is one of the, he stands for the 1.5 million Jewish children that perished. And that's why we have to remember, and that's why we have to tell. And like I said, it's not a fun story. But if we dare to forget, then it can always happen again. And it has in the world, in different areas, different, you know, and it's, like I said, it's much easier to forget bad things than good. So, I don't know, how many of you have heard of Elie Wiesel? Elie Wiesel is a survivor of the Holocaust. He's French. He went through Auschwitz and when they liberated Auschwitz, actually, there was a great march. They thought that they lost, some say 1 million more people, because it was the dead of the winter, and they were marching the Jews. Excuse me, the Germans didn't know what to do, so they just were marching them out. And Wiesel's father, who had survived the whole time in the camps, died during this march, as did thousands and thousands of other people. So, I turn to two people who I feel can convey to you why I'm here. Elie Wiesel, who has, like I said, written countless books and well known, he's met with presidents, he's an outspoken person regarding what he went through and the obligation that we have to carry on, and he wrote, "To forget the dead would be akin to killing them a second time. For the dead and the living, we must bear witness." That's what I'm doing, and that's what I'm asking every one of you to do. And like I said, I know it's not easy. Hasn't necessarily been easy for me. Today's not easy for me, because I have to resurrect feelings and thoughts that I try to compartmentalize. Because, you know, I lost a lot in the Holocaust. I lost the chance to be a normal child with a normal extended family and things like that. And I think about that a lot, especially when I became a grandparent. I thought again how much I missed, and then I thought about how much my grandparents missed. So there's another great hero that I'll give you an important quotation. I don't know, does anyone here know who Simon Wiesenthal was? Simon Wiesenthal, he and his wife were both survivors of the Holocaust. They were in the concentration camps. And Simon Wiesenthal became the Nazi hunter. And everybody knows about Adolf Eichmann, and I don't know if you do, but I'm sure that your teacher will convey. He was one of the, probably the most famous of the Nazis that was arrested and tried in Israel and executed. And they say that he was the architect of the plan to kill all the Jews in Europe. But actually, Simon Wiesenthal caught over 1,100 Nazi people that were involved in the actual killing. And it's interesting because Wiesenthal, who died not that long ago, he was well into his 90s, said, even if I didn't catch them, they always felt that that breath in the back of their neck was me coming for them. So he was going to do this for a short time, and he ended up doing it for the rest of his life. He had a small office in Vienna, only traveled to Austria and to Germany, and that was because of the war crimes and the courts and testifying and accumulating testimony in order to penalize, jail, even execute Nazi war criminals. So the question that when someone asked Simon Wiesenthal, who was an accomplished architect, graduated college, everything, right? You said you were going to do it for a few years, and now we are all these years later, and you're still doing it. Why? And this is something else that I think about when I think about my father's experience and everybody else's is, Wiesenthal says, when my life is over and I meet up with the 6 million, I will be proud to say to them, I have never forgotten you. And that's what I'm asking every one of you, not to forget the 6 million. It's an emotional subject. I'm emotional about it, but the message, regardless, is true. We cannot forget. I drummed it into our children's heads. I'm drumming it into our grandchildren's heads because with the survivors going, it's easier and easier to just leave it alone because it's not a really pretty subject. So, like I said, that's a tidbit of my history. But this is the story of my father. Well, the story of Abe Foxman is an incredible story because when my sister called me that night, she was screaming on the phone and she goes, the song, which I think you have it on my telephone. Pardon me?
It's on the internet.
It's on the internet. The name of the song is The Man from Vilna. Abe Rotman, yes, from Canada had written this song. My father is in the credits. And it became a really famous song. Journey is the name of the group, and when our daughter was studying in New York, they would say, that's different. Her grandfather is the man from Vilna. You know, it was very, very famous. And that's why I think they were able to put this whole puzzle together so easily. But when my sister called me that night, she said, you're not going to believe this, but I found the boy from Vilna. And I thought, what is wrong? What have you been doing? You know, what do you mean the boy? The man from Vilna? You know, And then she went on to say that the ADL had been trying to reach them because they had tracked down the child, wanted to meet the person and give identity to the man who basically changed his life. And 65 years later, they had an opportunity to meet. I met him here, and I wanted to talk to him first privately. My husband and I went into a private room. He was here for a speech. And I brought out the picture of my father in his officer's uniform. And Abe Foxman, who is such a presence about this man, started to cry like a baby. And he says to Michael and I have to have this. I have to have this. And then he says, after 65 years, you think, did this really happen? You know, maybe, you know, like my sister said, was it a legend? But when we showed him the picture of the man in his uniform that had lifted him up, he knew that it really had happened. And that is how the journey then came about to reunite them, talk, and have a relationship. Because remember, he's the closest relative that I really do have outside of my family. These survivors, these people, are my family. So, if I didn't bore you, I don't think anyone's asleep. Well, maybe I have one over there. Why don't you hit me with your best shots? If that's all right. Is that all right? What kind of questions do you have? Oh, come on. Make it up. You're making me feel so bad. Come on.
She wants to know how your parents met.
Interesting story. Good choice. I told you my mother's from Lithuania. She just was on the other side of Hoover. Let's put it up front. And what the plan was is that you got on any train you could and you went south. Literally, you just went south. My parents would never have met had there not been a war. My father, as I mentioned to all of you, was a Soviet officer. First time he was wounded, it was with a bayonet that went in through his neck. And the second time, it was a huge shrapnel wound. So he was on furlough, you know, in the Russian areas there because they couldn't get the wound to heal. And he ended up in the hospital in Uzbekistan, where my mother had ended up after traveling as far south as she could. They heard that there was a Jewish person in the hospital, and the very small Jewish community there, you know, looked out for each other, and that was how they met. And it was a true love story. That's all I can say. It was an incredible true love story. You know, and ironically, my parents, you know, after the war, ended up in Poland, where my brother was born. Then they went to Sweden, because that was a very big place for, they would funnel a lot of the Jews from there, all of these displaced people. They had nowhere to go. And my parents ended up in Norway for 2 years. He was a rabbi in Norway for 2 years. My husband and I went to visit Norway because I wanted to see the shul, because that was the only place my mother said she would ever go again. And I don't want to embarrass Mrs. Gettinger, but ironically enough, when my parents were in Norway, a woman in the embassy broke her leg. It was Pesach. Ended up where she would be for Pesach, so she ended up being at the rabbi's house. And her mother came from New York to help her. And when the woman left, she said, "What can I do for you?" And my mother said 2 things. "Could you send me a salami?" I don't know. Must be a Lithuanian thing. I'm not sure. But can you send me a salami? And I would like to get a Jewish newspaper. True to form, the articles arrived. The salami was obviously, by that time, green. And the paper was outdated. However, my mother, who was reading it, read of a Lithuanian society in Detroit, Michigan, and the head of this society was Mrs. Gettinger's grandfather. And the ball, after my mother's first letter, the ball started rolling, and the organization sponsored, you have to have a job or sponsor in order to come over. They got a very big philanthropist to pay for their ocean voyage, first class. Both my parents were terribly seasick, but, and they arrived Erev Pesach, and the very first Pesach that they spent was with Mrs. Ginninger's family. So, that is a special bond as well. Because I think about it also. I know, nobody knows how small the world is till things like this happen. So, that's the story in a very abbreviated version. My mother died 29 years ago, and my father never remarried, and I don't think he could, because my father was imprisoned after the war. After he was a decorated soldier, the next month they arrested him for Zionist activities. He was in jail for 30 days. My mother was the one she was the one who bribed and got him out of there. I mean, what went on in that relationship? My father knew he could never share that with anybody else. It was just too deep. So, okay. Any other questions? Come on. Go ahead.
Where does your father live?
My father still lives in Oak Park, Michigan, which is a suburb of Detroit. It's actually now very, very populated with a lot of religious Jews live there. And my father has been a rabbi in Detroit from when he arrived with Mrs. Gettinger's family, and he went to college, got a doctorate degree, raised 3 children in the way that he wanted them to be raised after what he had seen. He wanted his children and grandchildren to know they were Jews and to carry it on. And we've all tried in our family to fulfill that. And he still has a minion in his house. And one of the things that I think that was very meaningful to my dad in his later years is he was a chaplain at William Bowman Hospital, very big hospital in the Detroit area, and he felt very strongly about visiting the sick. And it wasn't just the Jewish sick that he visited. If you went in a room and there was someone Jewish and not Jewish, he would speak to both, because he did not want to embarrass or trivialize the other person being sick and being there. So, there you got it. You have a question?
It's not a question. I think I found the man from Vilna.
Oh, you have a song? Play it.
So let's see if it's loud enough.
There's a video with it.
Yeah, video. Yeah, there is a video. So let's see. If it's not loud, we'll do it on the computer. But let me start. It's loading. Just a little piece. And those who sit closer, you can see pictures. sure we'll be able to
Go,
go
read,
online
yeah,
on here?
just hear the chorus, because the chorus is what it's. He's telling the story now. Oh, and then the next thing is we danced.
You can,
yeah,
you can
yeah.
say it's, because I don't think they can hear it very
Yeah,
well.
okay. Well, listen to it, because he talked about we danced with the children on that simple starry night. And there is actually, if you look at that or you do it on the computer, you see the shul, the bombed out shul, and the remnants of what was this magnificent, magnificent building. But obviously when this songwriter heard my father tell the story, it inspired him to write this song. And I guess nobody ever believed that these two players would meet. Okay, any other questions? Yes.
I know how difficult it is, obviously so emotional and so to drag up all the pain. Did you, when you were growing up, did your parents talk to you from the beginning, so to speak, or is this something that they were only comfortable later on in life? Because we hear so much about the second generation and
My parents were basically very open, I think. And in particular, I'm not the oldest because I have an older brother, but he was born very premature, a lot of problems. I was the one closest to my mom, and I'm considered the family historian. And, I mean, my father sometimes laughs because I can tell him the names of the people that were in the car when they were getting out of Russia, because I had heard these stories. And I feel, and this is what I want to convey to all of you, I felt a huge responsibility to remember all these things, to share them with my children, and to share them with all of you. I mean, I speak fluent Yiddish, and if I forget a word in Yiddish, I just get really upset, because I feel like I'm losing part of my legacy. Of course, my husband got me a dictionary, and it really works, you know. But that took a number of years. Why I didn't do it, but it's my legacy. So, am I emotional? I generally, when I've spoken to the public schools or anywhere else, yes, I'm emotional, but you know what? It's an emotional subject. And if I could stand up here, dry-eyed, etc., then I really wouldn't be telling the real story. It's very visceral over here. I will tell you, though, that when I spoke at one of the inner city schools, one of the questions, sometimes you learn more from the questions than you do anything else. Somebody asked me, if your relatives were alive today, what would you say to them? Now, let me tell you, that took me down. I was, but I also feel they have to know that I'm going to answer them, and I'm not ashamed for them to see that I'm emotional, because this is an important subject. And they were all looking, and I said, I would say to them, I am really sorry and sad that I didn't have the experience of being raised and being around you. And that's the truth. And I was jealous of families, I'll be honest. that, had their reunions and everything else. Or if I go to the doctor and they ask you for your family history and they want to know, well, what's your family history? Well, I can just tell you this part. I know that, but what's your family medical history? I don't know. Well, why don't you know? I mean, it will go on and on till they understand that I don't know. Well, how did your grandmother die? I'm not going to repeat what I often say, but I just say that my parents were survivors of the Holocaust. But there is a lack of sensitivity in the greater population to realize that there are a lot of people like me that don't know, their family medical history or other things. They do all this genealogy. I don't have anybody to ask. So, anything else? Was it that bad?
No, it was riveting that for an hour, nobody moved here.
Yes.
That's important to tell us.
Were you born in Europe or America?
I was born after my parents arrived in the United States. My older brother, was born in Poland, and he was born a pound and a half. Ended up in Stockholm, and if you want to look up a very famous Swedish hospital, it's Karolinska Institute, and he did not come home until he was a year old. My father always said he was the only child that he knew who had his pigeon a bed before he had his birth.
Vivian, we have a gift for you that the 8th graders, to raise money for their Israel trip and for Yad Vashem, made these beautiful batiks, hollow covers, and we'd like to give it to you on behalf of our school, and thank you very much.
Got another present for you.